Hey my students, how you doing? Hope you having good day. In this video, I am gonna talk about my student Deku. What if Deku inherited a forgotten sentient quirk? And subscribe for more, also like this video, it helps me to stay motivated. And don't forget to check it author of the story and show some love, name of this fanfic is Mimic by Crow with a Kazoo. So do check out the author of this story and check out entire work. Also if you have any complaints about videos, feel free to comment, I will try to improve them. Let's jump in video. Izuku stared at the door to the library, reaching his hand out to open the doorknob. He was sure that this library wasn't supposed to exist. It was nowhere on any maps of this area and looking up its name, Quirky Books gave no results. So yeah, he seriously doubted that it was actually supposed to exist. And of course, he wanted to know about the library that probably wasn't supposed to exist. So, he twisted the doorknob and walked inside, closing the door behind him. Everyone looked up and stared at him, most in either fear or surprise. Most of them were strangely mutated in some way, although it wasn't actually that strange, what with quirks and all that. Behind the desk stood a woman, most likely the librarian. She looked to be in her early 20s. She had short chin-length hair, which was dark brown, almost black in color. Her eyes were a beautiful golden color, framed by red glasses. She wore a traditional red kimono with a light yellow obi. She smiled gently at him and walked out from behind her desk over to a table. Come here, I have a story to tell you. It started over 200 years ago, at the dawn of quirks, the librarian began, as Izuku took a seat at the table, there were few at the time. Some feared them, while others admired them. At the time, most who had quirks were driven mad with power, throwing the world into chaos. I should know, I was there. However, there was a group of vigilantes, called the Peacekeepers. They were, in a way, the world's first heroes. They brought light in a time of darkness and were led by the first. The first was the younger of two brothers who had sibling quirks to match. One good, one evil. The first had a stockpiling quirk known as One for All, a quirk that could be passed down from generation to generation. His older brother had a quirk called All for One, which let him steal quirks and give them to others if he so desired. The eldest brother wanted to rule the world and he wished for his brother to join him. However, the first wanted nothing more than to protect innocent lives from people like his brother. The two brothers became opposing forces and ever since, One for All has been passed down among heroes in hopes of defeating the first brother who calls himself All for One after his quirk. The thing most people didn't know was that both of them were sentient quirks. They hid this fact from almost everyone, but I managed to find out. I befriended One for All, although I have long since lost sight of her. She's been covering her tracks quite well, recently. I don't know who her current host is. The librarian went silent and Izuku took this as his cue to speak, why are you telling me all this? Well, this library is able to be accessed by sentient quirks and myself. A regular human shouldn't be able to come here. Not to mention, you look exactly like how Mimic did. The librarian responded. Who's Mimic? Izuku asked, tilting his head ever so slightly. The librarian didn't speak for a moment, as if reminiscing. Mimic he was All for One and One for All's younger brother. He was a copy quirk and he never had a host. I had offered to be his host, but he refused. He wanted to share hosts with one of his siblings, but he didn't want to choose sides. We were friends, him and I. We built this library together for quirks like him who didn't have hosts. He only existed for 10 years, since a quirk survival is dependent on having a host I can't be sure, but I think that you might be his reincarnation. Izuku stared at the librarian owlishly, mouth opening, before closing once again. He didn't know what to say to that, honestly. Him? The reincarnation of a sentient copy quirk. But I'm quirkless was all Izuku could come up with. She smiled at him, well, quirks don't typically possess other quirks. Izuku wasn't sure what he had expected when he entered the library, but this was not it. He came back. Of course he came back. He still had questions after his last visit and not to mention, after the librarian had revealed that he might be the reincarnation of her old friend, he sort of felt obliged to go back. He let out a long exhale before opening the door, walking inside. The people inside didn't seem as scared of him this time, although some seemed surprised that he had returned. They were all quirks, he now realized. All of them except him and from what he could tell, the librarian. It explained why they were so surprised to see him entering the first time, he was a human and wasn't supposed to be there. Except was he actually even human? After what he'd been told last time he was here, he couldn't be too sure. The librarian smiled at him from behind her desk, you've come back, I see. Izuku nodded, why yeah. I have a lot of questions. Oh, my name is Midoriya Izuku, by the way. And I might have answers. Chiasa Eaka she responded, gesturing for him to come closer. He approached the desk slowly, coming to a stop a meter away. So, last time I was here, you said that you were there at the dawn of quirks. But that doesn't make sense because no one could live that long normally, so, do you have an immortality quirk or something? Izuku asked. Chiasa nodded, yes, it's called Fountain of Youth. Ever since I turned 20, it's been preventing me from aging. Does that mean you can't be killed? Do you get sick or does your quirk prevent it? Are you able to regenerate when you get injured? What would Izuku began rambling, only to cut himself off, sorry, I get excited when it comes to quirks. Her smile turned sad looking, don't apologize, it's fine. As for your questions, my quirk only prevents me from aging. I can still get sick or be killed. You look sad is that something that he? Izuku asked, trailing off at the end. Something that Mimic used to do? Yeah, it was. Chiasa finished for him. The library went silent after that and Chiasa left to use the bathroom. Izuku walked over to one of the empty tables, sitting down at it and resting his head in his hands. This was all so very weird. At first, he wasn't sure if he wanted to believe it that he might be the reincarnation of a sentient quirk, but at this point he had to at least consider it. Mimic had the same mumbling habit he did, apparently. Not to mention that according to Chiasa, they looked the same. He wasn't even supposed to be able to see this place, either, let alone enter, but if he were the reincarnation of someone who'd helped build it plus, if he had a quirk, a copy quirk would be the perfect fit for him, with how much he analyzes them. But, the idea of it was strange. All his life, he'd be the quirkless Deku, and now he was finding out that he might be the reincarnation of a quirk. It was just so surreal. He came back. He kept coming back. At first, it was curiosity, but after the 5th visit, it was more because of familiarity. Only 5 visits, and it felt as if he'd been going there his whole life. The more he went, the more he felt like maybe he really was Mimic's reincarnation. Sometimes, he'd spend the time talking to Chiasa, getting to know her better, he sort of felt like he already knew some things before she told him, like how she had a hobby of writing, despite never publishing anything. Sometimes, he simply studied for tests or worked on his homework. Sometimes he'd find a book that interested him and would sit and read it until he had to go home. He didn't really talk to any of the quirks there, not yet at least. He didn't know how to go about approaching them and none of them came over to him, so he still didn't know any of them. Although, he got a feeling that Chiasa would introduce him to some of them soon if he didn't introduce himself. Well, he'd just have to see what the next chapter of his life held for him tomorrow. Right now, it was 3 a.m. and he needed to sleep. Everyone looked up as the door slowly opened and Izuku stumbled into the library, tears in his eyes. Chiasa rushed over to him, Midoriya-san. What's wrong? It's nothing, I just had a really bad D-day. Izuku stuttered, wiping the tears with his sleeve. He walked over to one of the tables, sitting down as Chiasa followed him over. She sat down across from him, would you like to talk about it? He stared at the table, as if thinking for a moment before speaking, a lot happened. You Kaken destroyed one of my notebooks I worked so hard on it, too and he said ish should take a swan dive off our roof. Then a slime monster T tried to suffocate me, B but all might saved me. I asked if I could be a cool quirkless hero. Izuku paused, uselessly wiping away some of his tears, he said no. Chiasa was silent for a moment, wanting to make sure Izuku had finished speaking before she said anything, well, if it's of any consolation to you, I think you'd make a great hero, whether you have a quirk or not. Thanks, Chiasa-sama. Izuku sniffed, although he tried his best to give a smile. Chiasa opened her arms up in an offer to give him a hug and after a moment he crashed into her arms, tears in his eyes. He stayed at the library until his mom texted him, asking where he was. It was only later that day that he found out Bakugo had been attacked by that same sludge villain and ended up being sent to the hospital. Izuku sat in the car next to his mother, staring out the window as she drove them to the hospital. Earlier that morning, Izuku had accidentally let it slip that he'd been attacked by the sludge villain and so she was bringing him to the hospital to treat any damage the attack might have caused. She had already planned on going, she wanted to check in on the Bakugas, Mitsuki, and Masaru had stayed there overnight, refusing to leave Katsuki's side, but now that she had learned of Izuku's potential injury, that just made the visit all the more urgent. Honey, you should have told me as soon as it happened. Inko said, and Izuku nodded absent-mindedly. He knew that she was just worried about his well-being, but he really wished she would just listen when he said he was fine. He was, really. Other than burns and bruises from the bullying, he didn't have any injuries. Not to mention, those burns and bruises were the entire reason why he didn't want to go to the hospital. They would find his injuries and then he'd have to tell them about the bullying, which he didn't want to do. After all, if people found out about the bullying, Bakugo would get in trouble and then he wouldn't be able to become a hero. He didn't want to do that to Bakugo. But he hadn't been able to convince his mom not to take him to the hospital, so here he was, trying to figure out how to prevent Bakugo from getting in trouble because of it. The car stopped at the hospital before he could come up with something, though, and he climbed out of the car, along with Inko. They went inside and brought Izuku to a room as soon as Inko told them what had happened. Inko left to check in on the Bakugas once the doctors had started checking up on him. As he had already known, he didn't have any injuries other than bruises and burns, which had been easily treated leading to now. From what your mother told us, you shouldn't have all these burns. Can you please tell me what actually happened? Asked the doctor, a clipboard in her hands. And, well, Izuku couldn't come up with a good lie. So, he had to tell the truth. He stared at his lap as he said, well. Oh, one of my classmates, he has an explosion quirk, and he likes to use it on me. She nodded and asked, could you tell me his name? Izuku knew why she asked that. If he answered, then Bakugo would get in trouble. But, he wasn't going to lie to her, and it's not like he could just, well, not answer. So, once again he told the truth, be Bakugo Keikitsuki. She nodded once again, seemingly writing something on the clipboard, thank you. Would you be alright if I left you here for a moment? Once he had nodded she left, guilt seeping into his mind. He'd just ruined Bakugo's dreams, all because he couldn't keep his mouth shut and ended up in a hospital. He was worse than useless, he was just in the way of everyone else. Maybe he should just take Bakugo's advice. No, he couldn't just do that. What about Mom and Chiasa? They'd be sad if he did that, he didn't want to make them sad. If he really was Mimic, he'd already left Chiasa once. He couldn't do that to her a second time. He sighed, leaning against the wall as his own mind taunted him. Hopefully, Yue would realize that Bakugo was meant to be a hero and wouldn't ban him for something so silly. He came back to the library. He always did, it was one of the few places where he was accepted despite his quirklessness. Funny how a group of sentient quirks were more accepting of him than his own classmates. Although, he still hadn't really talked to any of them. Maybe it was about time to turn the page and change that. So, he mustered up the courage to talk to one of the nearest quirks. They were standing at a bookshelf, seemingly searching for something. They seemed almost dragon-like, with their wings, scales, claws, tail, and general face shape. Izuku walked over to where they stood and they turned to face him. Whatcha doing? Izuku asked, not having any other idea what to say. Before he could get nervous that he'd said the wrong thing, they shrugged, oh, I'm just looking for a new book to read. Got any recommendations? In a moment, Izuku went into a ramble about all of his favorite books, most being from the pre-Quirk era such as Wonder or The Hunger Games. At night, he learned that they were named Dragonlash and felt that he had made a new friend. Maybe, just maybe coming to this library all those weeks ago had started a new, better chapter in his life. Bakugo clutched the unopened letter in his hands, confused. The letter was from Yue, but it was still 10 months before the entrance exam, so why would they be sending him mail? It didn't make any fucking sense. But it's not like he could just ignore a letter from Yue, so he tore the envelope open and unfolded the paper. Both his parents stood beside the hospital bed he sat on, waiting for his reaction. His brows furrowed as he read, and by the time he finished, he was so pissed that he might blow up the letter. They fucking rejected me. Bakugo growled, and Mitsuki snatched it out of his hands to see for herself. Her eyes widened as she read, and when she finished she handed the paper to Misaru, turning to look at Bakugo. He had never seen such a bewildered expression on her face, as she said, Kitsuki Bakugo, you were banned from UA for bullying Izuku. Care to explain? Izuku sat in the car next to his mother once more as she drove them to the hospital. They were only going to visit Bakugo this time. Apparently, he'd be leaving the hospital in a week if everything went well. He'd be fine, but Izuku wanted to see for himself. After all, if he hadn't grabbed onto All Might's leg, maybe the sludge villain wouldn't have gotten free. Honey, you don't have to visit him, you know. The doctors told me about what he's been doing to you. Inko said, and Izuku shook his head, and no, I want to go. He needed to make sure his stupid mistake didn't end up hurting Bakugo. Inko sighed, but she nodded nonetheless. There was no point in arguing with him over it, really. They got out of the car once they were there, walking through the hospital in order to find the Bakugas. Inko led the way, since she had already visited earlier. They stopped at one of the doors, and not too long after Inko had knocked, Mitsuki opened the door. Oh, Inko-chan, Aizu-chan. Come on in. She said, smiling. They went inside to see Bakugo sitting on the hospital bed, a scowl on his face. Other than his angry expression, he looked like he was fine, and he always looked angry. But then Bakugo turned to face them. In an instant, his usual annoyed sort of anger went up to uncontrolled rage, and he was jumping out of the bed, explosions in his palms. Deku, you bastard, you ruined everything for me. He growled, moving to attack Izuku. Mitsuki and Masaru each grabbed one of Bakugo's arms, holding him back, and Izuku dived behind Inko in an attempt to hide himself. It didn't work very well, since he was taller than her. "We should probably leave," Inko said, ushering Izuku out of the room. Izuku complied easily, still shaken up by Bakugo's outburst. He should have expected it, honestly. Of course Bakugo would get mad at him and try to attack. His breathing started to speed up and Inko placed her hands on his shoulder. Hey, it's okay sweetie, you're gonna be okay. Just copy my breathing, okay?" She seemed anxious as she spoke, as if she wasn't entirely sure on how to handle the situation. He nodded nonetheless, slowing his breathing down to match hers. Copying was easy, he could do that. Once he had calmed down, she sent him back to the car while she talked to Mitsuki. That meeting definitely could have went better, but at least now he knew that Bakugo was relatively okay. Izuku had a very strange dream that night. He couldn't remember the exact details, but he knew that Chiasa was in the dream and there was an older girl who he'd been calling Nichan. He also remembered that he and Chiasa had been sitting in a shopping cart while the other girl pushed it all around the store. The dream felt familiar, though, and he briefly wondered if it might have been a memory from when he was Mimic. He groaned as he rolled out of bed. He didn't entirely want to wake up. He wanted to go back to the dream, it felt so right and while being pushed around in a shopping cart had been kind of terrifying, but, well, he wanted to have that kind of friendship. But, he had to get up, whether he wanted to or not. He got dressed, and after eating breakfast, he left the apartment, red shoes clacking on the sidewalk with each step. He didn't know why he was going to the library this time, but that was where he was going. Of course, it wasn't that strange that he was going to the library, that was where he spent most of his time anymore. No one really reacted to him entering anymore, they were used to him being here. He waved to Dragonlash as he walked past them, sending a glance to the empty desk that Chiasa would normally be standing behind. Izuku felt strangely drawn to a forgotten bookshelf in the back, one that he hadn't even realized was there. Curious as to what was causing it, he approached it, coming close enough to inspect the bookshelf. It didn't look all that special, it seemed pretty old if anything, with all the dust on it. Actually, that bit of the shelf looked like he could move it. He put his hand on it and pushed it downwards, causing for a doorway to open up. Did he just find a secret passageway? Yeah, he definitely just found a secret passageway. He looked around behind him and saw that no one was looking, so he went inside. The door slid shut behind him. The tunnel was made of stone bricks and shaped like an arch. It was lit by many torches, giving the area a sort of eerie glow. Izuku stood there in awe for a moment, taking in the scene before he continued on. The tunnel wasn't very long and led to a medium-sized room that looked oddly like someone's bedroom. Actually, it looked like a bedroom he might have had if he wasn't so much of a hero fanboy. There was only one picture in the room, sitting on the desk. In it were 3 people, that was Mimic, Chiasa, and a girl with short golden hair and shining blue eyes. That was the girl from his dream. In the picture, Mimic was giving Chiasa bunny ears, while Chiasa held up the phone, and the other girl had her elbows perched on both of them. They were standing in front of the library, although it looked a lot newer. Looking at the picture, he realized that he really did look like Mimic. The only difference was that Mimic's wide toothy grin looked far more genuine than any smile Izuku had given in a while. Before he realized it, he was clutching the picture close to his chest, tears rolling down his cheeks as he stumbled over to the bed, sitting down on it. A strange bittersweet feeling bubbled up in his chest, almost like nostalgia, except that couldn't be right, he'd never been here before. This was probably Mimic's bedroom, huh? His old bedroom, too. At this point, there wasn't any question in the matter, there was no way he wasn't Mimic's reincarnation. Not with, well, almost everything that had happened since he first came to this library. So then the other girl must be one for all. He mumbled to himself. The name didn't feel right on his tongue, though. Nichan. All it took was saying that nickname, and he burst into tears once more. Chiasa walked back into the main part of the library, having just went to the bathroom. She looked out at the quiet scene, sighing to herself. Midoriya normally would have come by now. There was a chance that something had come up, of course, but still, she had a sinking feeling that something was happening to him right now, and she couldn't help but feel concerned. She walked up to Dragonlash. Hey, have you seen Midoriya-san at all today? Dragonlash looked up from the book they were reading. Yeah, last I saw him, he was heading to the back. Dunno why, though. Chiasa nodded, and Dragonlash went back to their book while Chiasa headed over to the back. What would Midoriya be doing back there? Unless, he somehow figured out about Mimic's old room. She rushed over to the old bookshelf, and sure enough, the secret lever on the shelf had been moved recently, if the lack of dust there said anything. She pressed down on it, opening the secret passageway and heading inside. As she walked through the tunnels, the sound of crying became louder and more clear, causing her to pick up her pace. Had he been hurt by something? As she got closer, though, she heard him mumble out the word "Na-chan." Oh. That's probably why he's crying. She walked into the bedroom to see Midoriya sitting on the bed, clutching a picture frame to his chest. More specifically, the picture they'd taken when they finished building the library. "Hey," she said, voice barely more than a whisper. Midoriya heard her, though, as he looked up at her, wiping tears from his eyes. Chiasa-sama. I'm sorry, Chiasa-sama. I'm not sure why you're apologizing, but don't. You have nothing to apologize for." Chiasa responded, a gentle smile on her face. Midoriya hesitated before shaking his head. No, I should have taken your offer. I shouldn't have just left you like that." Chiasa sighed, moving to sit down on the bed next to him. "You were a kid, and you still are. Don't beat yourself up over it." He didn't respond, so Chiasa couldn't be sure if he'd actually listen, but he leaned onto her side, head resting on her shoulder. He was still holding the photo close to his chest, as if it would disappear if he let go of it. "So you really are him, huh?" she asked, although it was more of a statement than a question. He nodded nonetheless, still sniffling a bit. She hesitated a moment before asking, "Do you remember anything? From when you were Mimic, I mean." Kind of. I don't really remember anything, but this room feel familiar to me, I guess. And I recognize Na-chan. And I also had a dream last night, which I think was actually one of my memories from when I was Mimic." They continued to sit there in silence, Midoriya taking comfort in Chiasa's presence. It wasn't how either of them had expected the day to go, but maybe that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Bakugo groaned as he wrote out the application. He didn't want to be applying to any school other than UA, but with the stunt fucking Deku pulled, he was forced to pick a different one. Luckily, he hadn't been banned from all hero schools, just UA. Meaning, he was currently filling out an application for Shiketsu's entrance exam. It wasn't UA, but he'd be damned if he didn't end up being the best hero out there, whether he went to UA or not. He'd make UA regret banning him, just you wait. For the first time in a while, Izuku found himself hesitating at the library's door. After what had happened yesterday, he wasn't too sure if he really wanted to go in. Well, no, that's not it. He wanted to go in, why wouldn't he? It was probably his favorite place in Matsutafu at this point. But, well, would Chiasa treat him differently, now that they knew for sure that he was Mimic's reincarnation? Sure, he knew that he was almost the exact same as he'd been in his past life, according to what Chiasa told him, but, well, he couldn't really help but be nervous. He supposed 10 years of bullying would do that to you. He sighed, reaching out his hand to grab the knob. Even if he was nervous, he couldn't just disappear on Chiasa again. He let out a sad laugh at the thought. Wasn't that why he had kept coming back before the place grew on him? He hadn't wanted to put Chiasa through that a second time. He twisted the knob before he got caught up in his thoughts, opening the door up. The sight that greeted him was a familiar one for him, the others were all either reading something, looking at the bookshelves, or chatting with one another. Chiasa was behind her desk, doing whatever it was she did when she was at her desk. She waved at him, giving a gentle smile like how she normally did, and all the tension left Izuku's body. Things hadn't changed just because they confirmed it. Why would they? After all, they had already suspected it, this was really just a confirmation. Izuku continued to return to the library. It was a relatively normal Friday. Bakugo had been released from the hospital, so he was a bit stressed from trying to avoid a beating, but surprisingly enough, none came. Was it because he'd been banned from UA? Either way, he was a bit stressed from school, but it was overall a normal Friday. Up until he got to the library, that is. Well, that's not entirely true. Things were still normal at the library, it was only while talking to Dragonlash that things became, well, not normal. He wasn't exactly sure when it had happened, but at some point he must have activated his old abilities on accident because when he went to grab a notebook out of his backpack, he saw that his fingers had changed to look like Dragonlash's claws. Safe to say, he screamed for a good few seconds before he realized what had actually happened. Izuku sat in his bedroom, the one in Inko's apartment, not the one in the library, explosions popping in his hands. It was the middle of the night and he really should have been sleeping, but he had developed his abilities and he was just so excited to try them out. Okay, so maybe he shouldn't be mimicking Bakugo's quirk so soon, with all the bullying and whatnot, but explosion was just so cool, almost as cool as Bakugo. It was like he had started a whole new arc in his life. He could copy quirks now. It was so cool. Although, he probably should switch to a different quirk. While explosion was a cool quirk, almost every blast had him flinching. What was a different quirk he could try to copy? Oh, maybe he could try a mutation quirk. What mutation quirks did he know? Hawk's quirk was a mutation quirk. And it was a really useful one at that. He tried to picture himself with Hawk's wings, the same thing he'd done with Bakugo's quirk. When he opened his eyes again, he saw huge red wings bursting out of his back. His lip quivered with excitement as he tried to suppress an excited squeal. This was so cool. Excitedly, he attempted to make one of the feathers come off, and sure enough, it did. He telepathically made it fly around his room a few times and couldn't suppress his excitement any longer as he cheered, "Woohoo. Izuku, honey, it's midnight, you should be in bed." One for All walked along behind Yagi, invisible to everyone but herself. It was the way it had been for years. Ever since she fell out of contact with Chiasa, no one had known about her. Well, no one had known that she was a sentient quirk, at least. There were a few people who knew that she existed, just not of her sentience. She felt strange. She had, ever since Yagi had encountered that quirkless boy with curly green hair and wide eyes. He looked so much like her little brother, Mimic. But that couldn't possibly be right, because Mimic was long gone by now. He had died because he didn't have a host 200 years ago. Still, though, the similarity was uncanny. It made her miss her brother even more than she had in the past 2 centuries, and what Yagi had said to the boy didn't help any. She sighed to herself. Maybe she should visit the library later, talk to Chiasa. It would be good to catch up with her old friend. Izuku let the red wings spread out behind him, while some of the other quirks rolled their eyes, chuckling at how excited he seemed. He couldn't help it, after discovering his abilities yesterday he was just so excited to try them out, but his mom had made him go to sleep before he could really do that much with it. Which was why he was doing it in the library. Plus, he wasn't sure how to tell his mom about it just yet. After all, what was he supposed to say? That he was the reincarnation of a sentient copy quirk? That probably wouldn't end very well. Oh, how come when you copy me you freak out, but then when you copy Hawks then you're all excited? Dragonlash whined, although they laughed soon after, showing that they were only joking about it. I was just surprised is all. Izuku replied, playfully nudging them. They chuckled, well, why don't you copy someone other than Hawks? I mean, you copied him last night, didn't you? He hummed, before nodding, yeah, I guess I did. The feathers disappeared in an instant and he put his hand to his chin as he thought about it for a moment before snapping his fingers, I know. I could try to copy Edshot's quirk. After a moment of thinking about it, his arm flattened from the elbow down. Dragonlash chuckled, that'll probably be a hard one to control, even with how much you like to analyze quirks. Izuku nodded, yeah, probably. Shirudo-maki looked over the application for the 3rd time since she received it. It was from a boy named Kitsuki Bakugo, from Aldera Junior High. He had previously applied to UA, but was rejected because of a history of bullying. She had thought of doing the same, at first. But, now she wasn't too sure. Perhaps if he were to pass the entrance exam, she could help him grow to be a better person, at least, if he was willing to change. After all, that would be one less bully in the world, and that would be a good thing, would it not? She nodded to herself and set down the application. She'd let him attend the entrance exam, and if he passed, then as long as he was willing to become a better person, he could attend at Shiketsu High. Izuku sat on the couch, waiting anxiously for Inko to say what she had called him over for. Was he in trouble? Did she somehow find out about the library? Did she know that he could? Honey. I think it might be a good idea for you to switch to online school. Inko said, breaking him out of his thoughts. You don't have to if you don't want to, but I don't really think you should stay at Aldera, and other schools probably won't be much better about preventing discrimination. But wouldn't that be too expensive for you? Izuku asked. Inko shook her head, you don't need to worry about that, sweetie. I found some affordable programs that might work well for you if you want to look. I'll think about it. Izuku came back to the library the next day, a dilemma on his hands. He didn't know what he was supposed to do after his mom had talked to him about online schooling. He didn't want to burden his mom like that, but at the same time, there would be so many positives of online schooling. He'd have more free time to practice his abilities, he wouldn't have to worry about Bakugo, he could spend more time at the library. Still though, he couldn't bring himself to burden Inko for his own benefits. While she had said it wouldn't be a problem for her, Izuku knew that she tried to hide the stress he always brought her. She wasn't very good at hiding it, but he never bothered to tell her that. After all, if she knew that he knew, it would only stress her out even more, and he hated to see her so stressed because of him. But even though he knew that it would only make him more of a burden than he already was, there was that selfish part of him that so badly wanted to accept the offer. Which was exactly why he was coming to the library. He needed to talk to Chiasa, and she would talk him out of being selfish like that, and then it wouldn't be a problem anymore. And if she said that he should go. Well, Chiasa was smarter than he was, so if Chiasa said he should take online schooling, then he supposed that he would. But it was unlikely that she'd say he should. He walked up to the counter and Chiasa looked up from what she was doing. He still didn't know what it was and said, "Hello Midoriya-kun. How'd school go?" He shrugged in response, it was the same as usual, but I need your help with something. Oh? Did something happen? She asked and he nodded slowly. Yeah, last night, my mom said that I should maybe try doing online schooling. She already had some programs in mind and everything. Izuku started and she gave him a confused look. That sounds like a good thing. It is. Except, I don't want to be a burden to her, but I do want to try online school, so I don't really know what to do. Izuku sighed and Chiasa shook her head as if it was a silly question. Midoriya-kun. You aren't being a burden to her, you know. You're her kid, it's her job to take care of you. If she thinks that you'd be better off in online school and you want to try it, then you should. Thanks, Chiasa-chan. Izuku walked out of the library, earning himself a few stares since he had appeared out of seemingly nowhere after all, no one else could see the library. He was more than used to the strange looks by now, having been visiting the library for so long. It didn't take long for people to chalk it up to some sort of invisibility quirk, though, and they moved on with their day, and he moved on with his. His shoes thudded along on the sidewalk, their bulky soles making them heavier and thus a bit louder than others. Well, it wasn't near dark yet, and he certainly could stay out later. He wanted to head home now, so that he could tell his mom what his decision was. Plus, he heard that Gang Orca had been in a villain fight recently, and he was dying to analyze it. As he walked, he passed by a park titled Sakura Plaza, if he remembered correctly. He had passed it several times before, although he never actually went in. It was a nice place from what he could tell, though, with lots of trees, flowers and some playground equipment. He just never really had an interest in going there. As he passed it, however, he noticed that there was a strange figure in one of the trees. Curious, he approached it, only to realize that the figure was a short boy around his age, with a bird head and dark clothing. Is he stuck up there? Do you need help getting down from there? Izuku asked, and the bird-headed boy laughed like he had made a joke. Nonsense. I am not in need of saving, for I have become one with my brethren. He said, and Izuku nodded as if he understood what that meant. He looked around awkwardly, unsure of what to do. Although, now that he thought about it, that tree did look kind of comfy. Would you mind if I joined you, then? He asked, and the bird-headed boy nodded, I don't see a reason to prevent it. Izuku grinned at him and began climbing up without much struggle. Despite not being very strong physically, he was good at climbing trees since he often did it to hide from bullies. Once he had gotten onto the branch, he sat down next to Tokoyami. Oh, I'm Midoriya Izuku, by the way. Tokoyami Fumikage. The boy responded and he nodded. They sat in the tree together, mostly in peaceful silence, although they did converse some. That was when a dark, shadowy figure came out of Tokoyami's back. They were shaped almost like a bird and had glowing yellow eyes. It was relatively easy for Izuku to recognize the figure as a sentient quirk, having spent most of his time around them and, well, being one himself, he supposed. If this had been happening a month or two ago, before he went to the library for the first time, he probably would have freaked out over the prospect of meeting a sentient quirk. As it was, though, he simply waved and said, "Hi. I'm Midoriya Izuku, what's your name?" Instead of answering his question, however, they turned to face Tokoyami and with a huge grin said, "He's so nice we're keeping him." Tokoyami gave an exhausted sigh and said, "No, Dark Shadow. We cannot keep people. He has a dark journey of his own." Izuku gave an owlish blink and pointed to his chest, confused, "Me? Why? I didn't really do much of anything nice. I just introduced myself." "Well yeah, but most people get weirded out by that fact that I'm a sentient quirk. That, or they just act like I'm not here." The quirk, presumably Dark Shadow, responded. Izuku found himself feeling angry at that. Not at Dark Shadow and Tokoyami, but at the people who had rejected them just because of the way they were. Well, that's not right. They shouldn't treat you guys like that. Dark Shadow nodded to himself, "We're keeping him." "No, we aren't." By the time Izuku got home, it was almost sundown and he had obtained Tokoyami's phone number. Izuku and Inko both sat at the table, eating dinner together. The food was a bit cold, as Inko had finished it before Izuku got home, but it still tasted good. He sighed as he put his chopsticks down, staring at his plate. Now would be the best time to tell her his decision. "Mom? You know how you were talking about online school earlier?" Izuku asked and she nodded, swallowing her food. I think I want to try it. But, just for this year, because I want to at least try to get into UA once high school starts." It took a week for his mom to finish setting up the online schooling for him, as well as take him out of Aldera to enroll him in the new school. That week was rather uneventful, though, and before long, it was over. It was about time to start a new chapter of his life. After all, he had around 9 months before UA's entrance exam and he needed to train for it. It was the day Izuku started his online schooling and he was currently in the library, working on his assignments. His mom still had to go to work, so he didn't really see a point in staying at home to do his schoolwork. And besides, once he was finished, he could practice copying other quirks again. He wasn't sure he quite understood his abilities, yet he didn't know what kind of limits his copying had and what kind of side effects he might get from overusing it. Although, would he actually get any side effects? After all, he was the quirk, in a way, meaning the way his abilities worked might be different from other copy quirks. Actually, did copy quirks get drawbacks from overuse? He'd never really seen anyone with a copy quirk before, so he never got the chance to analyze them. Obviously, it would make sense for any drawbacks from quirks he'd copied to transfer over, but were there drawbacks to pushing his copying past his limits? And what limits were they? Could he copy multiple quirks at once? How long could he copy a quirk for? What were the requirements for copying a quirk? Aren't you supposed to be doing your schoolwork, not analyzing yourself? Chiasa asked from behind him. Izuku jumped a bit in surprise and turned to look at her, was I really muttering again? She nodded, yeah, you were. Sorry, didn't mean to startle you. Do you need any help with your school stuff or are you just excited about practicing? I'm just excited. I mean, I'm so used to being quirkless, so the idea of being able to copy quirks now. It's just really exciting, he replied, earning a smile from her. Well, once you finish your schoolwork, you can practice all you want. I'd tell you more about your abilities, but… well, we didn't exactly get to learn much about what you could do since there weren't many quirks back then. She said, ruffling his already messy hair. Izuku nodded, that's fine, experimenting with my abilities will be fun. Chiasa chuckled at his excitement and gave him a thumbs up as she walked away, leaving Izuku to finish his schoolwork for the day. It wasn't too hard to do and he finished in a decent amount of time. He closed his computer once he had finished and stood up, stretching. He moved a bit away from the table, not wanting to ruin it by accident. But what should he try to practice first? He needed to figure out his limits before he could try to train to push past them, but what first? He didn't want to start with trying to find out his time limit because not only would that risk tiring him out completely, but it also meant that depending on his time limit, he'd run out of time to practice. It would probably be smartest to figure out the requirements for copying other quirks. Otherwise, he might go into battle unprepared because he couldn't copy a quirk for some reason. Let's see, what was a common factor between all the quirks he's copied so far? So far, he's copied Dragonlash, Fierce Wings, Explosion, and Fold-A-Body. Well, they all were sort of dragonish, in a way, but that definitely wasn't it. The only other similarity he could think of was that he knew what all of them did. So then he should try to copy a quirk he didn't know about. His best bet would be to try to copy one of the other quirks who went to the library. Well, he had talked to most of them and knew some of their names, he didn't know what they actually did, so it was his best bet, other than just going out and trying to copy a stranger's quirk. Some of the quirks had really descriptive names that easily gave away what they did though, so he should try to copy one who had a vague name. But who? He looked around the room before his eyes landed on one of the quirks sitting alone at a table. Their name was Power and they were possibly the most cryptid quirk Izuku would ever meet. He knew absolutely nothing about them other than their name, but somehow they seemed to know almost everything about him. Of course, that might just be because they knew him in his past life, but Izuku figured that he would probably recognize them at least a little bit if that was the case. Anyways, he didn't know anything about them, so they would be the best quirk for Izuku to try to copy at the moment. Izuku squinted his eyes shut and tried to imagine himself copying Power, just like how he did for any other quirk, but it just didn't work. He opened his eyes up and nothing had happened. So then he needed to know what a quirk did in order to copy them. Okay, now that he had settled that, he should try to see if he could copy two different quirks at once. Arbor and Bubble could work. He tried to imagine himself with the two quirks and as soon as he did, a pained scream ripped its way out of his throat and he collapsed onto the floor, clawing at his hair. His head was pounding, it was as if someone was repeatedly whacking it with a sledgehammer over and over and over and it felt like he was being torn in two. He kept his eyes shut tight, the pressure behind them so intense that he didn't want to open them. His nose burned and he swore could feel warm liquid dripping out. He wanted to cry so badly, but he couldn't open his eye to do so and they burned and he wanted it to stop. He could feel tendrils coming out of him, but he didn't know what they were unless they were from Arbor. He could hear two pairs of footsteps coming towards him and familiar voices talking, but it hurt so much and he couldn't identify who they were or what they were saying. Someone's hand gripped his arms gently and pulled his hands away from his head, which lessened the pain a little bit. Had he been tugging at his hair? The familiar voices continued talking and he heard the door opening, followed by more footsteps running over and another familiar voice. The footsteps changed direction after a different voice said something though, and then the pain started to get worse and worse, and another pained cry pushed its way out of him, and he folded over on himself. One of the familiar voices left, and then the other one came back, and suddenly a soft blanket was draped over his shoulders. Then the other one came back, and the voices started talking again, but he still couldn't tell what they were saying. Then he felt something, probably a tissue, being pressed up against his nose, as if to stop the liquid from coming out of it. That was about when he passed out. One for all sighed as she looked at her little brother, saddened by the state he'd been put into. He had fallen over when he passed out, so he was now curled up on the floor, his old green blanket wrapped around him, and a bloody tissue on his nose. Ayaka stood across from her, and a dragon-like quirk she didn't know was kneeling in front of him. Some bubbles floated about the area, and tables and bookshelves had been knocked down from arbor. "I thought he was dead," she mumbled, and Ayaka nodded. "He was. This is his reincarnation. He goes by Midoriya Izuku now," she responded. The dragon-like quirk slowly pulled him up into a sitting position and held his shoulders to keep him there. "Geez, what did he even do?" they muttered, and Ayaka shrugged, shaking her head. "We can ask him later," she said, before crouching down to his right and wrapping his arm around her neck. "Bulb-chan, could you grab his other arm? We need to get him to a hospital." Bulb was a nickname that Ayaka used for her, although she didn't really know why she used that particular one. She nodded and did so, and the two of them worked together to take him to Ayaka's car and put him in the backseat. Ayaka walked over to the driver's side and said, "Do you want to come too? You'll have to stay hidden, of course, but..." "Yeah, I think I should come. I need to talk to him when he wakes up." Izuku's vision slowly returned, instantly met with an almost blinding white. The light from it hurt, and he instantly squeezed his eyes shut again. Machines beeped near him, adding to the dull throbbing in his head. There was pressure on his finger for something, and there was some sort of tube in his arm. It probably took him longer than it should have to realize that he was in a hospital. Before that, it was mostly just wishing that the beeping and the throbbing would stop. It took a while before he decided to open his eyes again, as well. The light still hurt, but he chose to ignore that for the moment, but once he managed to come to the conclusion of where he was, he wanted to figure out why he was there. Which, of course, led to him remembering what had happened earlier. He had tried to copy two quirks at once and then. It all started to hurt, and he had felt as if he was being torn apart by the two quirks. Did that normally happen when people with copy quirks tried to copy multiple quirks at once? Or had it been because he was the quirk? He didn't know. He did know, however, that he never wanted to do that again. Maybe copying quirks was fun and exciting and amazing, but what had happened from trying to copy two quirks was anything but. It was an experience he never wanted to go through again, and an experience he wished he never went through in the first place. However, he had went through it. But, well, he supposed now he knew, at least. Now he knew that trying to copy multiple quirks was overwhelming and he shouldn't do it anymore. There was a sudden knocking on the door, snapping him out of his thoughts. This was followed by Chiasa walking in, gently shutting the door behind her. "Oh, thank God, you're awake." Izuku's head whipped around to look at her, taking in her concerned yet hopeful expression. He smiled at her. "Chiasa-chan, wait. Where's mom?" "She's not here yet. She wanted to stay overnight, but the doctors wouldn't let her. Bulb is here, though, but I think she's asleep," Chiasa said, smiling softly as she walked over to his bed. He looked at her, confusion etched into his expression. "What do you mean, overnight? And who's Bulb?" Chiasa chuckled to herself, shaking her head. "Right, you don't remember. Bulb is what I call one for all. As for the overnight part, well, you've been asleep for 17 hours. Izuku chose to ignore the last part, instead saying, "Na-chan's here. But you said you haven't seen her in years. And she's here." She nodded. "Yeah, she came to the library yesterday while, well, you know. She's invisible right now, since no one's supposed to know about her, but she's here. I've already told her that you don't remember anything, so be ready for her to tell you a bunch of stories about what we did together. Also, she might call you Mimi, it's a nickname she used to call you by." Izuku nodded, and they fell into silence. He was, admittedly, excited to actually meet his sister, but with the pounding in his head, it was hard for him to actually focus on it, or much of anything for that matter. Eventually, though, a question popped into his head, which he immediately blurted out. "How much of it do they know?" She looked a bit surprised by the question for a moment, but she didn't take long to answer. "I told them that I saw you in the middle of a migraine at the park and I brought you here when you passed out. I didn't tell them what had caused it, which is partially because I'm not entirely sure myself, but I'm guessing it had to do with you copying multiple quirks." He nodded in response. "Yeah. I was trying to test the limits on what I could do. Should have expected there to be some sort of backlash, honestly. Don't beat yourself up over it, Midoriya-kun. There's no way we could have known that this would happen after all, we never really got the chance to test out exactly what you could do back then. She replied, gently ruffling his hair. I'd suggest that you tell them what caused it, though. That way they can help you better. As far as I'm aware, there's no reason for you to keep it secret. Chiasa continued, and Izuku nodded. She was right. The only reason he hadn't told anyone yet was that he never really had gotten a good chance. Either he forgot to tell Inko, or she was doing something else already. They went silent again for a moment, which was about when One for All became visible, standing right next to Chiasa. Mimi. It's been so long. Despite her clear excitement, she kept her voice low. Izuku couldn't help the tears that welled up in his eyes when he saw her, despite never seeing her in his life before. She was a stranger to him, but at the same time, she was his sister. Tears started to stream down his cheeks, and in a voice barely more than a whisper, he said, "Na-chan. I thought it's nice to see you." It was odd. It always had been, ever since he went to the library for the first time. Ever since that day, his worldview had been flipped on its head, again and again. He learned the quirks could be given or taken. He learned that somehow, people did care about how he was treated, enough that Bakugo had been banned from UA. He learned that he was the reincarnation of a sentient copy quirk. He learned that he had two older siblings, one good and one evil. He learned that he could copy quirks. But none of that was quite like seeing his sister in person for the first time. He was at a loss for words. What was he supposed to say? One for All no, Na-chan. He liked Na-chan better. Na-chan teared up too, but he could tell that they were happy tears. She was smiling at him, a smile even brighter than All Might's and more real, too. It was strange, having someone smile at him like that. He smiled back. Her smile was infectious, he couldn't help it. She launched herself at him, though she was careful not to mess with any of the machines attached to him. Her arms wrapped around his torso in a bear hug, and after a moment, he hugged her back, tears streaming down even more. They stayed like that for a while, seconds, minutes, Izuku couldn't say. Chiasa was silent throughout it all, giving the sibling quirks their space. It was weird to think of himself like that, too. He was a quirk. Most of the time, he didn't think about it all that much, but sometimes, like now, he would have the sudden realization that hey, this is real. I'm a quirk. A complete change from before, when he thought that he was quirkless. Na-chan separated from him eventually, and as she did, footsteps from outside began heading in the direction to Izuku's hospital room. She smiled sadly, "Looks like I have to go invisible for now. We can catch up later at the library, alright Mimi?" "Why yeah." He responded, wiping at his tears in an attempt to dry them as she faded away. Moments after he had mostly dried his tears, the door swung open, revealing a worried-looking Inko. She teared up when she saw him, awake and sitting up, which made Izuku tear up once more. Just the same as Na-chan did, she ran up to him and hugged him, while crying out, "Izuku. My baby." He flinched at the volume of it, and a nurse came in soon after. "Don't be so loud. He just had a migraine, so he'll probably still be a bit sensitive to loud sounds." "Oh, I'm sorry Izuku, I didn't mean to," Inko started, only for Izuku to cut her off. "It's alright, Mom. You didn't know. Honestly, I didn't realize it either." Inko pulled away from him, and the nurse spoke up again. "Is it alright if I ask you a few questions, so we can find out what happened?" Izuku nodded slowly, and she began asking him questions as she checked his vitals. Izuku answered them almost completely honestly, although he lied about how it had happened in the park, rather than admitting that it occurred in the library. After all, no human other than Chiasa knew about it, so it was better that he just say that he had been practicing with his abilities in the park. Inko seemed happy for him when he said that he could now copy quirks, which wasn't very surprising. She knew how bad things had been for him while he was quirkless. The doctor came and went, ushering everyone else out when he was done checking up on Izuku. Something about how Izuku needed space in order to recover. Leaving Izuku alone with his thoughts in the hospital room. Izuku was released a couple of hours after he had woken up, and by that point, the pain had mostly subsided. He went home with Inko, texting Tokoyami while she drove the car. He figured that Inko would probably want to keep him in the house for a while after that had happened. The doctors had given him a prescription for migraine medicine, but they had also said that it was probably an effect of overusing his quirk, so he should be fine as long as he didn't do it again. Not like he planned to do it again. That was not at all a pleasant experience. But despite what had just happened, there was a giddy feeling in his chest, and he couldn't help the small grin that appeared on his face. He'd just met Na-chan for the first time. And she had promised that once he recovered, they could talk to each other again, which was something he'd be looking forward to. He'd never really had someone who he could consider as family before, he realized. His mom was nice, sure, and while she clearly cared about him, she just never really supported him in his dreams, and that hurt. He never really managed to consider Auntie Mitsuki and Uncle Marusa as family, despite his nicknames for them. He only ever saw them when Bakugo was also around, and Bakugo being there made it hard. Chiasa and Tokoyami weren't family either, just friends. And Bakugo? He didn't want to think about Bakugo. He wasn't entirely sure that he'd be able to get that kind of thing from Nichan either, honestly. After all, that was his first time meeting her. At least, in this life. Nichan already recognized him as her little brother, though, and he referred to her as Nichan, not because he had to, but because it felt right. Sure, he was worried that things wouldn't be the same as they were in his last life, seeing as he had completely different memories and experience shaped the person. He might be different than how she remembered him, or maybe he had stayed the same, but she changed and no longer would get along with him. But mostly, he was excited. He wasn't sure what was causing it, perhaps the traces of his past life left in his mind, or maybe just the concept of having an older sister he could look up to, but a feeling of warmth and comfort made itself home in his mind whenever he so much as thought of their brief conversation in the hospital. It was nice, and he wanted more of it. There was a part of his mind filled with half-forgotten memories of what they did together, the sensation of her playing with his hair in order to soothe him to sleep, words that she had said to him. It was there, he knew it was, he just couldn't fully recall it. They might have come from his dreams, or they might have always been there, and he was only now realizing it. After all, he'd always been Mimic. He just didn't realize it before. He was glad that he had found out, though. His life had always seemed just a tad brighter after he had arrived at the library for the first time. His phone buzzed in his hand, alerting him that Tokoyami had responded and pulling him out of his thoughts. Hopefully, Inko wouldn't insist on keeping him inside for too long. It was only a day later when Izuku returned to the library. He had spent most of the day he got home resting, but now he was ready to go back to the library, and so he did. As soon as he entered the library, all the other quirks inside came over, checking to see if he was alright and such. He wasn't very close with most of them, but they still seemed to care about him despite that, though it might be because of how fond Chiasa was of him. Once he had managed to convince the others that really, it's fine now. It won't happen again, things calmed down again, and everyone went back to what they were doing before. As soon as that happened, Izuku spotted Nichan, talking to Chiasa. He wasn't sure what had possessed him to do it, but as soon as he saw her, he called out, "Nichan." Just before running at her and hugging her. Chiasa chuckled, and Nichan ruffled his hair. "Hey there Mimi. You feeling better?" "Yep." He chirped, smiling at her. Not 2 seconds later did he realize what had just happened and instantly let go of her. "I'm sorry I didn't mean that it was already having me just interrupted your conversation and she'll just get back for a hug at you." "Hey, slow down Mimi, you need to breath, remember?" Izuku promptly took a huge gulp of air, nodding, "Right, sorry." "Well, I'm glad you're feeling better now." Nichan grinned, ruffling his hair once again. "Now, I believe we have a lot of catching up to do." And so they did. Izuku went first, since he was younger, and therefore it wouldn't take as long for him to finish. He made sure to be brief about it, though. His life wasn't exactly good, and he didn't want to make Nichan sad by telling her about it. Once he had finished, Nichan began to summarize everything that had happened to them. How he had been created by All for One by mashing together a copy quirk and a quirk that made objects sentient, how he had tried to prevent their family from splitting up, how they met Chiasa in a Denny's parking lot at 2 a.m., how the three of them worked together to build the library. How he had disappeared one day, only for them to later find a note that he had written saying that he was probably dead. She didn't linger on that for very long, instead moving on to tell him various stories of things they did together, such as the one time they had a shopping cart race in the grocery store. "I don't know how you two managed to talk me into that." Chiasa chimed in, to which Nichan shrugged. Nichan then turned to him and loudly whispered, "It was your puppy dog eyes. Only a monster could resist those." He blinked at her, tilting his head slightly. I have puppy dog eyes. I am going to teach you how to do them later, don't worry." Nichan affirmed, nodding to herself. Chiasa groaned in the background. "Okay." Izuku chose to ignore Chiasa's protests of him learning the puppy dog eyes because it was apparently how he and Nichan got away with half of the crazy things they got up to. How many of those things were his idea, Izuku had no clue. He didn't think he wanted to ask, though. He walked out of the library with a wide grin, completely ignoring the strange looks he got from walking out of thin air. He was well used to them by now. Meeting Nichan had been better than he ever could have thought of, and he was just so happy. She had been so much fun to talk to, and she had lots of interesting stories as well. Most of which made Chiasa roll her eyes in a way that said, "These idiots are lucky that I love them." Nichan said that she was being a mom. Nichan hadn't taught him how to do the puppy dog eyes yet, but he had a feeling that he could count on it happening. Currently, he was making his way to the local cafe. Tokoyami had requested that they meet up there, and Izuku had seen no reason to say no to it. The cafe was nice, so he figured it would be a good place to meet with a friend. Well, he liked to think that he and Tokoyami were friends, anyways. He entered the cafe and found his way to an empty booth, waiting for Tokoyami to show up. As soon as the bird-headed boy entered the cafe, Izuku called out, "Hey Tokoyami-san, over here." Izuku was sobbing when he woke up. For the first few seconds, he wasn't entirely sure why he was crying, but he couldn't make it stop. Then memories of the dream he'd had that night pried their way into his mind, and the tears fell harder. He remembered leaving a note on the library's desk, a note he didn't dare look at. He remembered sneaking out of the library in the middle of the night, anxiously looking over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching. He remembered running as soon as he was out of the library, urgency filling every step. He remembered that he was looking for someone, that he had something important to tell them before it was too late. He remembered his legs getting weaker underneath him, yet he continued on anyway. He remembered his body becoming transparent, causing his urgency to grow stronger. He remembered collapsing onto the floor, legs unable to carry him further. He remembered crying out, in pain and in sadness. He remembered feeling like he had failed, but he had no idea what he had failed. He remembered that his hands were almost completely see-through. Then he woke up. He wanted to tell himself that it was just some horrible nightmare, it wasn't real and it hadn't happened. But he knew who he was. He was Izuku Midoriya, the reincarnation of Mimic. Once a sentient copy quirk that lived in the dawn of quirks, now a teenage half-quirk living in a world where quirks dominated everything. He knew that in his past life, he died because he didn't have a host. He knew that he sometimes got memories of his past life in the form of dreams. He knew that his nightmares were never anything like the dream he had just had. The conclusion he came to wasn't one he liked to think about. Those were his dying moments in his past life. Other than it being a bizarre nightmare, that was the only conclusion that made sense. Part of him wanted to pretend that was all it was. A bizarre nightmare, something his mind had made up to scare him. But he never had nightmares like that, and he had no idea why he would. While he sometimes felt guilty about how he had left Chiasa in his past life, he'd figure that a nightmare about that would be different. Plus, he doesn't live in the library, so there was no reason he'd be sneaking out of it in the middle of the night. But in his past life, he had lived in the library. He knew that, he had been in his old bedroom before. The tears eventually ran out, but the memory of it lingered in his mind, along with a question. Who had he been looking for? After the dream, things continued on as normal. He continued to go to the library and do his schoolwork. When he finished his homework, he hung out with Nichan and the other quirks. Sometimes he would practice copying quirks, though he found that there wasn't much to practice. There were only two limits on his ability to copy quirks. He needed to know about the quirk, and copying two quirks at once was agonizing. He never told anyone about the dream. He didn't tell Inko or Tokoyami because he couldn't. They didn't know that he was a sentient quirk, they couldn't know. Letting people know what he was would lead to them finding out about his siblings, and both of them were national secrets. Letting people know would lead to them trying to make him into their quirk. Maybe Inko and Tokoyami wouldn't do such a thing, but others would. He didn't tell Chiasa or Nichan because he knew that the subject of his death was uncomfortable for them. They didn't say it, but they didn't have to. He could tell. He didn't tell the other quirks because if he did, Chiasa or Nichan would eventually find out, which would defeat the purpose of telling the other quirks about it instead of one of them. So no one knew that he had a dream recounting his last moments in his past life. No one but him. That made it hard to figure out exactly what had happened, though. He had a good guess as to what the note had said, as well as the message he was trying to deliver, but who had he been looking for? And why had he needed to sneak out to find that person? He had no way of answering those questions. He couldn't look it up, the world didn't even know Mimic ever existed. He couldn't read about it in one of the library's books, none of the books had anything to do with his past life, and he was fairly sure that he didn't have a diary. If he had, it would have been in his old bedroom. Since he had no way of answering them, he tried not to think about them too much. A hard feat considering his natural curiosity. That, along with what the dream had been about. Ignoring thoughts involving a dream about his last moments proved to be rather difficult. He'd manage it, though. Tokoyami was unsure what to make of Midoriya. Midoriya wasn't like anyone he had encountered before. Most people feared him for his lack of control over Dark Shadow, and those who didn't fear him, pitied him. Most people ignored the fact that Dark Shadow was their own being, and those who didn't ignore their sentience treated them as if they were a monster. Most everyone was off-put by either his bird head or the way he spoke and dressed. Midoriya did none of those things. He didn't care that Tokoyami couldn't control Dark Shadow. He treated Dark Shadow as a friend just as much as he treated Tokoyami as one. He wasn't off-put by Tokoyami's bird head and in fact found it as super cool looking. Tokoyami didn't understand why. What made Midoriya so different from everyone else? Even his parents didn't like him because of Dark Shadow, who was an unexplained mutation of a quirk that couldn't have come from anywhere within the family. When Midoriya blinded him and Dark Shadow with a smile as bright as the sun, the two of them came to a simple conclusion. Midoriya Izuku was an angel. You're telling me All Might is your host? Izuku yelped after a few seconds of silence. Nichan had been telling him a story about her current host's debut, a story that Izuku had easily recognized from all the times he rewatched the video of All Might's debut. Nichan chuckled, nodding, I guess I forgot to tell you that, huh? Izuku nodded, torn between rambling about how cool being All Might's quirk must be and feeling sad about how his encounter with All Might had turned out. It must have shown on his expression, because her expression turned soft. Hey, what's wrong, Mimi? He looked away from her, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. It was stupid, really. It shouldn't matter anymore, he might not have a quirk, but he was able to copy them, and everyone else thought that copying quirks was his quirk, so it should be fine. It shouldn't matter that All Might said quirkless people couldn't be heroes, because he had his copying ability now. Plus, Chiasa had said that she thought he could be a hero, with or without a quirk. But it still hurt, and he didn't know why. Izuku never answered Nichan's question. He didn't know what was wrong. He knew it was because of what All Might had said to him, but he didn't know what was making it hurt still. Tears poured down his cheeks, prompting Nichan to engulf him in a hug, whispering reassurances to him. And maybe she had figured out what it was, because she said, I think you'll make a great hero, Mimi. He cried harder after that, but those tears were happy tears. It was 2 months after he had met Tokoyami and 7 months away from the entrance exam when it happened. Izuku, Tokoyami, and Dark Shadow were sitting in a tree, same as they had when they first met, talking about the recent documentary on Gothic-themed heroes. In the middle of Izuku's rambling, Dark Shadow blurted out, you're a sentient quirk. Like me. The statement startled Izuku enough that he fell out of the tree. Ow. Tokoyami climbed out of the tree and helped Izuku up. Are you alright? Yeah, I'm fine. He replied, brushing the dust off himself. Thanks for helping me up, Tokoyami-kun. But why would you say something like that, Dark Shadow-kun? I'm human, you know that. Dark Shadow shook their head rapidly. No, you are. I dunno how I didn't notice it before, but you have the same energy as a sentient quirk. Wait, do you have a host? Are you dying? What? No, I'm fine, I'm not dying. Izuku waved his hands around wildly, before pausing. Wait. What do you mean I have the same energy as a sentient quirk? Tokoyami nodded in agreement. I would also like to know what you mean, my shadowy friend. It's kinda weird. But sentient quirks can sorta just tell if someone else is a sentient quirk because we just give off a different energy, I guess. I don't know why you wouldn't know about that, though, since you're one of us, Dark Shadow explained, the last part clearly directed at Izuku. Izuku paused for a moment, thinking. He could tell them that he wasn't a sentient quirk and say that's why he didn't know about it. But he was friends with them, wasn't he? And plus, Dark Shadow was a quirk like him and Tokoyami was their host. Both of them seemed trustworthy enough. Except he wasn't really supposed to tell anyone about his past. Mimic was supposed to be a secret, same with his older siblings. But he could tell them the truth without spilling his secrets, couldn't he? Yeah, I'm a sentient quirk without a host. But don't tell anyone, okay? I don't really want people knowing. Izuku said, rubbing the back of his neck. Tokoyami nodded, I will take your secret to the grave. I mean okay, but you don't have a host. That's not good, you'll end up fading. Dark Shadow responded, making hand gestures to emphasize their point. Izuku shook his head, no, it's fine, really I can handle myself. Plus, if I do get close to fading, I have options. So please don't worry about it, okay? Dark Shadow seemed reluctant at first, but they nodded, alright, if you say so. After that day, nothing very eventful happened. Izuku continued to work on his copying, applying his analysis to the quirks when he copied them. He didn't need to train his copying itself too much, but his control over quirks he copied had needed a bit of attention, some more than others. He had grown closer with Tokoyami and Dark Shadow after sharing his secret with them, although they still didn't know the full truth. It was unlikely that they would ask about it any further, though, as they didn't really have any reason to suspect there was anything more to it. From what he had heard, Bakugo had been training hard for the Shiketsu entrance exam. He hadn't seen him training, of course, but Izuku had found himself avoiding Bakugo now that he actually could. He had also been spending more time with Nichan lately, which was nice. But now, it was the day before UA's entrance exam. He paced around one of the tables at the library nervously, mumbling to himself. Chiasa chuckled, pulling him out of his thoughts. You'll do fine, Izuku. Nichan nodded along with a grin, I'll be cheering for you, Mimi. Izuku paused, but slowly nodded, right. Yeah, I'll be fine. I can do this. It was nice to have people who believed in him. That's it for today guys, I will stop here. I hope did you enjoyed this video. If you do, please leave a like, share and subscribe. Also don't forget to check out author of this story, link in description. Until then, take care, bye bye, we'll see you in next video.